You're listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis, the only podcast focused on the biohealth capital region. Each episode, we'll talk to leaders in the industry to break down the biggest topics happening today in biohealth.
Hi, everyone. This is Rich Bendis, your host for BioTalk. We have a taping we're doing over the holidays, and it break in January, early January, but we have a friend of the biohealth capital region and biohealth innovation. We have Ben Holmes, who's the chief executive officer for Nanochon. And we have a lot to talk about today because there's been a lot of updates with the company since he won the grab trap competition. So Ben, welcome to BioTalk.
Yeah, my pleasure to be here. Thank you, Rich.
Hey, happy holidays to you.
Yeah, same to you.
Yeah, and this is probably the heaviest assignment you're going to have during the holidays. So we're going to make it very easy for both of us. So I think what the listeners would like to hear, first of all, is a lot of people don't know Ben Holmes. A lot of people don't know Nanochon. So the first thing we're going to do is let you do a little introduction of yourself. Tell us about some of those important facts people would be interested in learning about your background.
Sure, my pleasure. So I am happy to talk about myself and then talk a little bit about the company. So I've been a medical device entrepreneur, primarily working with startups, really for the last decade. My first project working on designing a new product was back in 2013 when I was still in grad school. But my training has primarily been in engineering and biomedical sciences. So I got my PhD from George Washington University. I was broadly working in the tissue engineering field, which for those who are not familiar, is basically any strategy, technology, therapeutic, implant. It can really include a lot of different things, but it's basically trying to regrow body parts. So using materials and advanced manufacturing, trying to make structures or implants or therapeutics that actually try to regenerate parts of the body. So we were really working primarily in musculoskeletal health. And at the time, the lab was really focusing on joint health. So we were really looking at injuries and arthritis. So both the traumatic and the degenerative loss of cartilage, which leads to really significant pain, leads to a real impact on people's quality of life just because it becomes difficult and painful to get around. And that's really because the soft tissue that protects the skeletal system is wearing away. So you lose both strength in the joint, and then you also lose comfort. And over time, that damage continues to spread. A lot of things can start to break down in the joint. You can almost think about it almost like a car. If you've got like a little problem, the wheels are out of alignment, or there's low pressure in the tire, that just cascades over time. And so that's really what happens to people as well. And the end stage of this so-called disease of osteoarthritis is needing a total knee replacement. So total knee replacement, it's a very common surgery, something that a lot of people are familiar with. If they haven't had a knee replacement, they probably know somebody who has. I actually have 3 people in my family that have had joint replacements. And it's something that is typically done on older people. And that's simply because these are people that are not participating in marathons or not doing really intense exercise and are usually not working. The challenge, though, is that as arthritis becomes a much more prevalent issue, as people are developing osteoarthritis earlier in life, they're actually reaching that end stage of the disease earlier. And there's actually been some really shocking statistics. I think that the number of total knee replacements has doubled in the last 10 years. And then also that median age at which people are getting knee replacements continues to drop. And so what I'm trying to point out here is that this thing that was typically thought of as, something that when you're older, maybe you're in your 70s, maybe you're in your 80s, you just need to be able to get around a little bit and you're going to get a knee replacement. This is now becoming something that very active and potentially still working people in their 60s and even in their 50s and even in their 40s are having. And it really all starts with the fact that there's no way to address that cascade, that breakdown in the cartilage sooner. So if there's a way to address that cartilage damage much sooner, maybe say in someone who's in their early 40s, in their 30s, or even in their 20s, that could potentially mean that nobody needs a knee replacement later on in life. And so that's really where we at Nanochon fit in. We are developing a new solution really for treating that patient population. So not the people that need the knee replacement, but the people that have sustained some type of loss or damage to the cartilage that is definitely going to lead to a knee replacement later on. So that's our product we're developing. It's an implantable device. It's designed to both replace and regenerate the cartilage. And I think the thing that makes it really unique is that it's a totally off the shelf product. And so that's been another big challenge in the space, which I'm sure we'll get into a little later. But the fact that this is something that can be as easy, or if not easier, to use as a knee replacement from the surgeon's perspective.
Well, you just described me, someone in their 70s who has had 2 knee replacements, but I wore them out during marathons. I'm not doing them anymore because I can't put all that pressure on the knees anymore. But I should have met you 30 or 40 years ago, Ben, but you weren't doing this 30 or 40 years ago because you probably weren't born 30 or 40 years ago. But you're a typical engineer. You would like to talk about technology and get rid of products. All that they know about you is that you got your PhD from GW. They still don't know anything about your background, other than you were highly educated and you decided to get into this business. So what I'd like to go back before we go forward, talk a little bit about your personal history. Why did you decide to choose the field of education you did? Did someone influence you to decide to be an entrepreneur and form a company? And a little bit more about that background, sort of how Nanochon evolved through your earlier background.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do so. And apologize for getting a little too excited, but you're right. We talk about the technology all day long, but I'll try to talk about myself a little bit. Yeah, so I started as a pretty classic mechanical engineer. I did mechanical engineering undergrad. My dad was an engineer, also mechanical engineer, but he worked primarily in the construction industry. And basically, I thought building buildings was really boring. So I liked math, I liked science, I liked elements of mechanical engineering, but I didn't want to just go into construction. So I was lucky to get exposed to biomedical engineering early on. I had a keen interest in orthopedics and biomaterials and material science. So I kind of used a lot of my electives in undergrad to explore those things. But I was really sick of school after 4 years of mechanical engineering. So I did go to work for a big construction firm, because that's one of the things that a mechanical engineer with a bachelor's and not much else can do. So I went to work for a big design build construction firm doing both big infrastructure projects and commercial building projects, and basically hated it immediately. All my instincts were correct. But I got some good experience. I learned a bit about project management, kind of matured a little bit. And then after 2 years, I went back for grad school. And my original plan was to just basically get a master's degree as soon as possible and then go work for like a Medtronic or a Smith & Nephew or a Stryker. So I knew I wanted to kind of go in the medical device direction, and orthopedics generally was interesting to me. And so I started, I guess this was back in 2011, started my master's program at GW in Grace Zhang's lab, which is the tissue engineering lab, and got exposed to a lot of ideas that were new to me around tissue regeneration, basically using both advanced materials and advanced manufacturing to try to make these structures or these constructs or these substrates that kind of mimic the body and allow cells to grow. So I got really excited about this field of research. And then this was right around the time that 3D printing really was starting to blow up as sort of a hot new technology that people were kind of using everything for. And Grace really wanted to explore 3D printing as a new way to make these constructs. And so we got like a really cheap little printer. I think literally someone bought off of Amazon or something, struggled to kind of get it to work. But once we did, we're able to basically use 3D printing as a way to really design these complex structures to kind of address the types of tissue damage that happens in the joint, because that's one of the challenges, is that where cartilage and bone connect is really complicated. So we were able to do a nice project, get the paper published, and I really fell in love with the work really because of that project, and was delighted when she invited me to actually stay and become a PhD student. So that was, I guess, 2013. And so I knew I really loved this field. I wanted to continue exploring research and innovation. And then that was also right around the time that I really got exposure to entrepreneurship as well. So I got approached by the tech transfer office to talk about licensing some of the IP that we had developed. And the course of that combination, somebody said to me, have you ever considered doing a startup or entrepreneurship? And I kind of thought, oh, not really. That's not something I ever really envisioned for myself, but it sounds really exciting. It sounds like it could be a great option that I just hadn't thought about. So I said I wanted to learn more. And so that's when I got hooked into the Office of Entrepreneurship at GW. Right around this time, George Washington was also putting a lot of energy and resources into building up this support system and programming for entrepreneurship. And later that year, we actually did Jim Chung's first local cohort of I-Corps programs. So for those who don't know, the National Science Foundation has this thing called I-Corps, which is for highly technical people, engineers, scientists, essentially developers of technology that are interested in doing a startup. And it forces you to go through this process where you actually talk to your customers and find out what are the problems they're having. And so it really teaches you to think about the customer experience as you turn this technology into a product. And it's sort of designed to rewire your brain a little bit. And so Jim did, I think, one of the first quote unquote local versions of this program, because the National Science Foundation runs a national level one. So we went through that program, and it just really energized me and really got me thinking about doing a startup, and really got me thinking about what are the key components of these different technologies, because we had probably like 3 or 4 different cartilage projects in the lab. So it really helped me kind of think about not just is the technology meeting some scientific goal, but is there actually an opportunity to provide something that people would want to use, in this case, people being the surgeons treating these conditions. And at the same time, I also started getting involved with this company called Sonostick, which I referenced. It's another medical device company, another spin-out from GW, and it was founded by 2 doctors from the ER. Has nothing to do with orthopedics, but I met them in 2013 at a startup competition at GW, and I believe they were the winner for the second place company. And I thought, wow, this could also be a great opportunity to just join a fast-growing startup. They had just gotten a little bit of funding. They had a really great presentation, but they needed engineering support. They needed somebody to actually help them build a functional device that they could start testing. And so I saw that as an opportunity to join a company like that and really kind of learn on the ground. And so I also really credit my experience with that company, which I am still involved in a little bit, and also kind of teaching me some good lessons and showing me what it was really like to be in a startup. And so by the time I was graduating from the program at GW in 2016, I've been working with this Sonostick company for a couple of years. They had gotten FDA approval for the product, and we've gone through product iterations. So I'd kind of seen all of that. I'd seen how they interact with clinicians. And then pairing that with the I-Corps experience really felt like doing the startup was something we wanted to do. And so I graduated at the beginning of 2016, like in January, and a week later, my partner in the business and I went to a lawyer's office and started a company.
Thank you. Once I get you going, though, it's very interesting to hear the evolution of this and how you progressed and learning experiences. I think that's very beneficial to other people who are considering doing that, Ben. So you don't necessarily know that you want to be an entrepreneur immediately, and you had an iterative process. You went through this to actually make that decision to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it really is, to use all the cliche metaphors, it's like jumping off a cliff with both feet first. And yeah, it's not something that we took lightly. And even knowing what I know now and looking back on young Ben in 2016, I think, wow, I really didn't think this through. But at the time, something I'd been thinking about for years, and I really benefited from a lot of good support and a lot of good people that had kind of come around me and continue to come around me. I mean, that's the thing about medical devices, and not just medical devices, but any type of biotech, pharma, therapeutics, anything. It really takes a village. And so I think that you need that support network early on to really help activate your idea and activate the company. It's not like software. It's not like a consumer product or a consumer business where you can literally start it up in your garage. It takes so much expertise and so much effort. And so I think that that's the one piece of advice to anybody who is considering starting a company and has never done it before, is just make sure you out of the gate have at least a good stable of 3 or 4 advisors who can kind of cover all your blind spots. And then you just have to keep growing the team from there. And that's always served us really well.
What a great segue. You must be looking at the script we wrote, Ben, because you went right into the next thing we're going to talk about. And that's really, how did you decide to form your team, your board of advisors, your board now? How did all that evolve? Because generally you have to surround yourself with people who have different skill sets than what you have personally. So how did you determine you needed advisors, and then how'd you go about the process of selecting them and then actually building your team from that?
Yeah, absolutely. The most important thing is knowing how to raise money. And so I think that it's really important very early on to have at least a mentor or some kind of advisor who has raised money for startups before, very broadly, a medical device or a pharma startup. It's better if you've gotten somebody who's even more specific in your niche, but you don't necessarily need that early on. And so I actually met a handful of good mentors through iCore and started working with a gentleman, Matthew Shear, who actually is now our CFO. So someone I had a long relationship with, but he was really the first person that I kind of sat down with and they kind of talked about what it's like to raise money and also just what it's like to do basic venture math, financial planning, things like that. When we went through the national iCore in 2016, that's also where I met my first really good technical advisor. So somebody who from the engineering and the science side had helped support the development and launch of products and had worked on things in the cartilage space, and is a gentleman named John Rodriguez. Also someone who continues to advise the company. So also somebody that I've had a long, deep relationship with. And then the third key person that we brought on early was a clinical advisor. So again, going through iCore, because iCore forces you to talk to a bunch of customers, I met a handful of surgeons who had worked with startups, had worked with preclinical development, shepherding things into clinical trials. And so was able to pick up a few surgical advisors. And so that's really, I think that's kind of what the early core team should look like. I think as the company grows, you'll hit key milestones. And it's always a question of what do I need to accomplish the next milestone? And then what do I need to have teed up to quickly reach that next milestone? And so just as an example, we brought on some really talented clinical advisors who have run first in human clinical trials. So that's the stage the company's at now. We've gone through a lot of really extensive preclinical testing, animal studies, bench tests, safety tests, all that stuff. And we're now ready to put it into human beings. So we've now brought on people who have done that quite literally. So I think you just always kind of have to have a mind for what's that next critical thing. And I think that those milestones can also be sort of prioritized really just based on how they're going to create value for the business. We've gotten a lot of feedback from potential commercial partners and from later stage, like basically investors that we'd be approaching at the next round, that's the thing they really want to see is they want to see some kind of clinical data. And so I've had a lot of people telling me, well, you need to put more effort into marketing, you need to put more effort into product development, you need to put more effort into this and that. But I think it's really also using that customer discovery mentality to really probe into what's the thing that the people that are going to invest in your business, what do they actually need to see? What do they actually care about? And so that's also a great way, like all these steps along the way to really prioritize what is the critical milestone and what's something else that we should think about. It's important, but it's not going to move the needle in terms of raising capital. Because I think ultimately that's the other challenge about this particular business is it is so capital intensive, and you're probably going to be looking at least 2 or 3 rounds to even just to get to market, let alone the funding you're going to need to grow in the market. So it's something that you have to spend a lot more time thinking about, again, compared to other types of startups. And so I think that's also something that having the right advisors at the right time will help you think about and then help you execute.
And since you're really into the technical side, the engineering side, the product side, it's nice to have somebody that can also assist in the fundraising side, because that's something that ABR is the term that they use for entrepreneurs like yourself when you're starting a company, and that's always be raising. And so let's talk a little bit about your raising and funding experience since you started in 2016 with the company to where you are today. About to get into 2024. It's hard to believe now the company's 7 years old, Ben?
Yes, we are 7 years old, and I guess we'll be turning 8 in January.
How about that? Well, let's talk a little bit about the funding required and how you have funded the company to get to this stage before you get ready for the human trials, which is going to cost a lot more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that medical devices are also a really unique intersection of things that are challenging early on, but can actually end up being benefits later on in the company's life cycle. And I think that really what it comes down to is that if you're a pharma company, even if you're a therapeutic company, it's really just a question of, does the chemistry work? And if the chemistry works, then it can be pretty easy to push out and market a pill or an injection or whatever the form factor is. Medical devices, depending on what they are, and in our case, there certainly is a clear therapeutic effect and a therapeutic benefit, but it's not a bottle of pills that a patient's going to take home after a doctor writes a script. Really, it's a product that a surgeon's going to use. And so even though the patient is the beneficiary, really the customer and the user is the surgeon, to really put it simply. And so I think that medical devices, they kind of have this dual risk of it has to be safe and it has to really work. But then also it's got to be something that a surgeon's going to want to pick up and use again and again and again. And so I think that you have to do a lot of work early on to really demonstrate that. Obviously, going through iCore twice helped us really get a lot of good surgeon feedback. And we, again, to this day, continue to work with really experienced product developers and surgeons to make sure that that product is being delivered in the right way. But it's an extra risk factor that kind of stacks on top of the fact that you also have to show that the product is going to work. And so I think that that's the challenge, is that you have to address both of those areas. And that can be difficult, especially because you're talking about, you're talking about a lot of capital requirements, not just to do technical work, but also to do this boots on the ground customer process. And so our funding story was kind of a long, drawn out one, which again, I think is very typical in medical devices. We're not that much older than sort of the average lifespan of a medical device company, the ones that make it. And so we got really good at pursuing grant funding. When we started the company, we had a little under 100K in grants. So we had a small research grant that basically allowed us to do our first animal study, showing that the material is safe at all and also has any kind of effect in a more complex environment than just a petri dish. And then we also got a grant from the National iCore program. So again, for those who don't know, National iCore that the NSF runs does come with a $50,000. At least it was $50,000 when we did it. It might be more now, but also comes with a grant, which you can spend on non-technical activities, i.e. customer discovery. So traveling around the country and talking to a lot of surgeons for us is what that meant. And so that allowed us to kind of address both of those key areas early on. And then I think beyond that, our next tranche of funding was an SBIR. So we also got a phase 1 SBIR from the NSF, which again allowed us to kind of do both things. And I believe the NIH does something like this now, but at the time the NSF was really kind of pioneering marrying SBIR funding with an iCore style program. So then we went through an iCore style program, again, not nearly as rigorous, but we still had to do, I think, like 50 interviews, and we had a mentee from NSF. And so again, continuing to de-risk that commercial element, as well as continuing to do these additional large animal studies that showed the effect of the device, showed good cartilage growth, showed good integration with bone, all those things that are important. And then we were gearing up to raise our first round of institutional capital in late 2019. We had been getting pretty good feedback and interest from folks, again, because I think we had this good package of both de-risk commercial and de-risk technology. And then the pandemic happened. So the whole world shut down, investors stopped picking up the phone, and there were certainly some tough kitchen table conversations. The thing that I kind of realized, though, coming out of it kind of towards late 2020 is that we didn't have really anything ongoing that was threatening the business and forcing us to step away, right? Like we didn't have like an ongoing clinical trial that got shut down. We didn't have purchase orders that got canceled. There were a lot of challenges that later stage companies didn't make it because they basically weren't able to advance their companies and had expectations. And we were basically able to just kind of wait it out. So at the end of 2020, when investors started to poke their head out again, and when we kind of experienced that crazy upshoot in biotechnology investing and capital markets, we were able to pull around together. So we ended up raising $2.7 million in our seed round, had a lead investor by the spring of 2021, and then we were doing a first close by the fall of the same year. Did a couple small extensions to get to 2.7, but basically that was the first real kickstart of capital saying, okay, you've done enough to show that this technology is working. You've done enough to show that if properly executed, a product would be very popular. And now here's the money to start really developing. And for us, that meant refocusing on how do we get to the clinic? How do we get through FDA? So the main use of funds was a horse study. Horses are one of the preferred animal models by the FDA. So doing really powerful large animal study to really show safety and efficacy. And then also doing a lot of work on the manufacturing side. So really kind of manufacturing in also validation. So just showing we can make this stuff reliably and of high quality and all that. And then also just kind of doing some of the other really boring stuff, but the stuff that's really important. So just kind of like standard safety testing and continuing to do a little bit of customer discovery as well. So that kind of catches us up a little bit. We have also raised more money again. What a tough year to be doing that, but I feel incredibly lucky that we were able to get some good funding in. So we've closed about 2.9 million to date. And this is the funding that, as I've talked about, is going to take us to the next step. This is going to allow us to do a first in human clinical trial. We are looking to do that here in the US, and we're expecting that we could be doing the first human patient sometime over the summer.
Thank you for that. That's a very good primer, really, for a lot of people talking about the different stages you go through. One of the things that's very consistent with you, and we'll talk about this a little more later, but you keep talking about customer discovery, and you've done it every step of the way, because what you have to do is to continue to validate with the customers as you continue to progress with your technology that you're going in the right direction. And that helps you tweak as you go through every one of the stages. So most engineers are not market oriented or customer oriented, but I think you've found out that you can't progress your science and your technology unless you have some close discussion going on related to what customer needs are as they continue to evolve.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's something that also makes healthcare and medical devices more complex than other endeavors because, as I said earlier, and as you again alluded to, the patient is benefiting from this. I mean, that's the ultimate goal is, broadly speaking, we really want to improve patients' lives, but patients are not the customer. It is the clinician who's going to be using this on the patient. And so you have to really think about what's giving them headaches and how are you going to align their incentives with that incentive of providing better care, because sometimes those are also different things. And I kind of will leave my comment there, not trying to make an ethical statement or anything, but it's just a reality, right? That like clinics and hospitals and surgeons, like these are organizations, they are in a way businesses, and they have to be able to operate and they have to be efficient, they have to be cost effective, and those things flow back into better care, we really believe. So, in like you said, we're even at a stage now where we've done a really thorough work to show that the device has a therapeutic benefit, but now we're tweaking it. We're designing surgical tools that the surgeon will use to actually deliver that implant. And all of that just requires going back to those customer discovery conversations and having new ones. So it never ends.
It's an ongoing process. You're stating it very well, Ben. I think this is very beneficial conversation for other existing or wannabe entrepreneurs who have an idea that want to get into the medical device field. So let's talk a little bit about this area of where you're located. Are you originally from the DC area, or did you land here? And then how have you found what we call the biohealth capital region beneficial for you? Have been educated at GW, but you could have gone anywhere. I mean, with this company, why did you decide to stay here? And what have you found about this region and the ability to support what your ideas and vision are for Nanochon?
Yeah, I mean, those are great questions. And I would have been the last person to predict that I would have stayed in the DC area this long. I mean, I always assumed I was going to move to the Bay Area or Boston or even places like Philly or San Diego or Seattle. I never envisioned that I would have a life here the way I do now. But I think that, it really just comes down to having the right resources at the right time. Oh, and by the way, to answer your other question, I am from the area. So I grew up in Northern Virginia. Always liked DC. Again, didn't necessarily think I was going to be here so long, but I ended up going to GW for grad school. And so that kept me here for a little while. And then when we founded the company and got that first research grant, our partner was actually Children's National. So, I mean, that kept us here for a little while because we actually were working out of their lab space, out of the Sheikh Zayed Institute, and using their resources was one of the benefits of getting collaborative grant funding with them. So the company really was sort of incubated out of there early on. And then, again, I sort of assumed that we'd move at some point, but when we got that SBIR, the work that we needed to do was really on the preclinical testing side. And large animal studies are something that, again, are really highly specialized. It's not like there's a dozen CROs in the Boston area that can do things the size of a goat. which is what our first study was. I mean, those animals need large housing facilities, a lot of specialized care, even just doing the surgeries is highly specialized. So we ended up doing that goat study with a lab in Fort Collins, Colorado. And there's not a ton of places in the country that can do that kind of work. Ironically, there are now places here in the DMV that actually do that kind of work because there's a lot of space out in Maryland where you can put in the right types of facilities to do this stuff. So if that had existed at the time, we probably would have partnered with some of those groups, but it's neither here nor there. The point is that the work we were doing was being outsourced essentially. And so again, there was no immediate reason for us to move. And then when we were raising that next tranche of capital, the question was, does this company need to be in another market in order to attract investors? And what we ended up finding was, one, no, that's the simple answer. But I think that the more complicated answer is that our lead investor and substantial investors were local investors. So, our lead investor is the University of Virginia Seed Fund, and we got a substantial investment from the Cav Angels. We also did a research project with Virginia Tech and got investment from Virginia Tech's fund as well. And so capital partners in the region kind of came in to support the company. And now that we're continuing to grow, it's almost like because the company is becoming more valuable, but it's becoming more valuable and investable to really highly specialized investors, that sort of traditional thought process of like, oh, well, if somebody's going to give you some money, they're going to demand that you move to where they are. That next level of capital doesn't seem to be doing that. And again, because it's not like Boston and San Francisco are like hotbeds of orthopedics. Like I would argue that there is no real concentration of orthopedic focused startups, and those later stage funding partners that are really interested in orthopedics and are interested in invasive implants and PMA devices. I mean, they're already used to looking across the country and sometimes across the world. So the market of startups is not concentrated anywhere. So there's no immediate reason for us to move the company. And then I think on top of that, this area just continues to grow and continues to offer more and more resources for growing companies. Like I mentioned before, it didn't exist at the time, but now there are these CROs in the area where you can do like these larger FDA enabling animal studies. And I think investors are looking at this market as well. National investors are looking at this market, among others, as a place where there's a concentration of interesting startups. The fact that you're so close to the national institutes as well, because we're not stopping our grant activities. We're continuing to apply for non-dilutive funding, and all those agencies are here. It makes it easier to kind of network with those people and those agencies. So, I mean, there's a lot of non-dilutive funding opportunities, which I think continues to make this area extremely unique. And then also FDA's here. If you need to have an in-person meeting with the FDA, it's easy to do that. There's a lot of great FDA consultants in the area, IP firm. The major firms all have big concentrations here. So I think the one challenge is that even though we've gotten a lot of support from investors in the region, have still had to look to those outside markets for investors. And that just takes a little bit of extra effort. So I think that's the one thing that is still a challenge in this area is I can't just get in my car and spend an hour driving around the region and hit up enough VCs to get funding. You still have to put in some extra legwork, spend more time traveling. But when it comes to everything else, I mean, the area has a ton to offer, and it's probably better than most other places. So it's a unique time, and I think it continues to grow as well. So it's exciting to kind of be a part of it.
Yeah, you summarized it well. It's just that our Sand Hill Road probably goes about 180 miles, and it's not a couple miles. So it does take a little more energy to get to visit the exist. But you've done a great job of getting local investors in the company to be the lead, because a lot of the people outside, if they don't see local interest in your company from around your own area, then why should they come? That was a great description of all of the resources that are growing within the biohealth capital region. But I think there's another one that you've been a beneficiary of, and that Johnson & Johnson has their incubation program, which is international now, and they have 13 locations. And they have one in the DC area, and you happen to have an affiliation with them. You want to talk a little bit about your J Labs affiliation?
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of ties into what I was saying as well, that we always assumed that we were going to end up moving the company somewhere different. One of the shorter term opportunities to do that would have been to go into a J Labs. We have been getting a lot of interest from DePuy Synthes, which is the orthopedics division of Johnson & Johnson, and had actually a couple mentors, just informal mentors within DePuy and also within J&J Innovation that I've been working with really since 2018. And we actually were a virtual resident of J Labs. So again, not taking advantage of the community or the physical resources, but being able to have some of that kind of mentorship and networking opportunity. And so our assumption was always when we raised money, we would physically move into a location. And so I think the closest one to us would have been Philly, but we were also looking at New York. And then there's a couple locations in the Boston area. So we were kind of thinking of somewhere on the Eastern Seaboard. But right as we were closing that first tranche of money, they actually opened a J Labs here in DC. So again, that kind of goes back to what I was saying about how like this area just continues to become more attractive to a global group of stakeholders and also continues to grow and have more resources. So the J Labs opened in September and we moved in October 1. And it's really just been a great experience. Not only is it an opportunity to just have, I'll say, premium space when you're a startup and also have access to a lot of equipment that just really saves on cost, but just the community they've built, my other peers that are in the program, it's something that continues to be a really great system of resources and support. And also, again, just getting that greater visibility at Johnson & Johnson, since they have a very strong relevant interest in our field. So the mentorship and the help from them continues to be extremely beneficial.
The way you're partnering with resources in this region has made 3 of my board members very happy. Kurt Newman, past president of Children's Nationals on the board, and he continues to serve on our board. Sally Lane, who is running the DCJ Labs, is on my board. And then Mike Friedlander from Virginia Tech. And Virginia Tech has a presence in that campus where J Labs and Children's National has some of their incubation facilities, is on my board. So, I mean, it really shows how this ecosystem is really coming together, and you are really one of the beneficiaries of taking advantage of a lot of resources that are in your backyard that sometimes entrepreneurs don't recognize, that they can get in the car and be very close proximity to those that are going to be really potentially short-term or long-term partners for your company, Ben.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely well said. It's great that that connective tissue keeps getting stronger between all these different players. So it's been great for us, and it'll continue to be great for next generation of companies.
Yeah, for our listeners, we're talking to Ben Holmes, who's the CEO for Nanochon and one of the co-founders of Nanochon. And we're going to continue to wind up this podcast, but I think we're going to continue by doing follow-ups with you because you're at a critical stage right now, and that's the next phase we're going to get into in this little interview. And that's really, what are the most critical milestones you have in front of you, Ben? And what do you see as the plan to achieve them? And I know human trials is really one of the biggest ones that you have in front of you.
Yeah, definitely. We are a PMA device. And so for those that aren't super familiar with medical device regulation in the FDA, we are much closer to a drug than we are to really traditional medical device like an injector or catheter or even knee replacement. We have to do human trials to show that it's safe and that it works, essentially. So our next immediate milestone is the first human trial. And so that would be a pretty focused safety study, just putting this in 10 patients and tracking how they do anecdotally. This is also kind of a critical stage because it's the point at which we go from scientific evaluation to clinical evaluation. So all the work we've done to date in our animals, you're really looking at histology, which anybody who has done a middle school biology class has seen histological slides. It's the cross-section of tissue that's stained so you can see what cells look like and what the structures look like. So just doing a lot of that work primarily to evaluate how's the implant interacting and what's grown. But going to this next step, it's really about, is there a clinical benefit for the patient? And you obviously can't remove someone's knee after a clinical trial and then slice it up and see what it looks like. There are ways to sort of look at that with MRI imaging. So that's something we're going to do. But the primary endpoint is pain. And so there's a variety of these different pain and knee function scoring systems, which are essentially complicated surveys. So you're just asking the patient in a bunch of different ways how they feel and how has their recovery been, and are they experiencing a benefit from this treatment? And so this is the first time where we really will be doing that and really going from purely scientific evaluation to something that really talks about the human factor, the human benefit. The next stage after that is going to be raising more money, now talking about going out for like tens of millions of dollars. to do that larger clinical trial. And that's where it starts to look a little bit more like a traditional drug development pathway. We're going to do hundreds of patients. We're going to have to compare it to a control. We're going to have to show statistically that our treatment can be better than the standard of care in some way, which again, we're feeling very good about just because the amount of rigor that's gone into just the preclinical testing, I think, is above and beyond. And we're expecting this first human trial to look really well. But really, it just kind of becomes all about the clinicals at this point. The other thing that we're working on is we've put a lot of work into the implant itself, but now it's talking about what's the best way to implement this in a surgery, what's the best way to package this as a product. And so developing a unique set of surgical tools, essentially, which are specially designed to put our implant in place, do the procedure as seamlessly and as reliably as possible, can also be really critical, because the last thing you want is for your technology to not benefit patients because of user error on the surgeon's part. And even highly trained surgeons need to practice new things before they're going to do it reliably. And so I think that's also kind of the next thing, alongside just clinically showing this is clinically efficacious and getting FDA approval. It's also developing that total package to ensure really seamless rollout and adoption by surgeons of the product. So that's kind of what's in store for us for the next couple of years. And then I think when it comes to actually launching the product, there's actually a strong history of pre-commercial acquisitions. So we're not really looking to reinvent the wheel here. We're planning on following that same pathway, which has been available to companies like ours that have to go through this so-called PMA process. By generating clinical data, you also prove efficacy and you create something that can really be quite powerful for the marketing of the product, and something that in the hands of the right major strategic partner could make a much bigger impact in the market than if we tried to roll it out ourselves. So that's also our plan, is that by 2027, this thing is close to getting FDA approval. We feel like we should be able to find that right partner to acquire the product and really be the one to commercialize it.
Well, your path is relatively clear going forward, and you've been able to achieve the milestones to get to where you are today. And 2027 doesn't sound as far away today as it did when you started in 2016, does it?
Yeah.
You're only 3 or 4 years away. And as you continue to achieve these milestones, some of those potential exit strategies will continually emerge. So as we close here, Ben, this has been a very informative podcast that we've been doing with you. Do you have any advice, one kernel of advice you would give to an emerging entrepreneur, whether they're already in the process with their company or somebody who's thinking about doing a medical device company in the same way you have, as sort of your last words for this segment, because we will do a follow-up segment with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's a little bit of a cliche, but I think it's one that I've heard over and over again, and I definitely feel like it's proved true. This is going to take twice as long and cost twice as much as what you think it's going to today. So just think really critically about your assumptions around the cost to develop, the cost to commercialize, or the cost to get whatever that endpoint is for you. And I would say, going all the way back to kind of the beginning of this conversation, just make sure you have really good experienced people advising you that can help you really kind of pressure test those assumptions. Because the last thing you want to do is raise money, not hit a milestone, and then run out of money, because people don't like that very much. So yeah, just really pressure test your assumptions around what's going to take, and then have really good people helping you do that.
Well said. And that's great advice. I've always told people it's twice as long and twice as much money. And one of the things you can't really anticipate is a pandemic happening right when you're in critical stages of your company. So just to be able to survive through that stage has been a major accomplishment. So we congratulate you, Ben, for getting Nanochon to where it is today. There's a number of other things I wanted to pick up on, but like I said, we'll do another one with you. I want to talk about some of the awards you've gotten today. You're winning the crab trap competition, hopefully, which increased your visibility. But I think that's a whole nother story, which we can talk about on the next episode with Ben Holmes, who's the CEO and co-founder of Nanochon. So, Ben, I want to thank you for the time you've devoted today during this holiday season to take a little time away from your family, talk about something you're passionate about, which came through in this interview. And we wish you the best of luck.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. And I just want to wish you a happy holidays as well. And happy holidays and happy new year to all your listeners. And it's my pleasure to be here. So happy to come back the next time you want to have me on.
Thanks for listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis.